Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American Spy Fox, and today we have a very, very special guest joining us for a very long discussion. For this reason, I have broken it up into categories, into subjects. They will all be uploaded to the same playlist. This is the first of many. Max Wallace is joining us now. In case you've never heard of Max Wallace, more than likely you've seen him on Soaked in Bleach. But Max is a Canadian investigative journalist and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. As a former music journalist, Max co-authored with Ian Halperin 2 books. Number 1, Who Killed Kurt Cobain? Number 2, Love and Death, The Murder of Kurt Cobain. By the way, the first book, Who Killed Kurt Cobain, was on the New York Times bestseller list, and I recently heard that autographed copies are going for over $100. As a historian, he has written The American Axis, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and the Rise of the Third Reich, and the collaboration of 2 American icons. Another very interesting book. Coincidentally, I'm also obsessed with old-timey boxing. Muhammad Ali's Greatest Fight, Cassius Clay versus the United States. This encompasses the fight that Ali would have with the government over the Vietnam War and his own beliefs. The foreword is written by Muhammad Ali himself. Personally, I gotta get this book and read it. In 2013, the book was adapted into a Hollywood film, directed by Oscar-nominated filmmaker Stephen Frears. By the way, I watched the film just a few months ago, but did not know that it was written by the guy that we're getting ready to talk to. His latest book in 2018, In the Name of Humanity, won the Canadian Jewish Literature Award for Holocaust history. For those of you who are watching this in real time as they come out, you'll get a notification. And for those of you watching in the future, what you want to do is this. Scroll down to my little blue fox icon, click on it, it will take you to my channel page, then you can click playlist, look for the Max Wallace playlist. I am editing them to try to make them as enjoyable, entertaining, and informing as possible. They'll come out one by one. Again, here's Johnny. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here with Max Wallace today. As you can see, Max is looking pretty good. I gotta admit, man, you're looking good. You look like, do you exercise?
I'm not looking as spiffy as you with your jacket there.
I know. People are loving the jacket. I've got a lot of compliments on this. Hey, everybody wants to know, I'm just going to jump right into this. How did this come about? You go into this investigation, obviously, like everyone else, with criticism, right? You're not a believer at the beginning.
With deep skepticism, you could say.
Right, deep
I stumbled upon it by accident, really. Yeah. But remember, this is what, more than 25 years ago now, right? It's a whole other era.
It's weird to think about because I all the time people are like, it seems like it was yesterday, but we do, like they say, life is too short. We all grow too fast. For my own curiosity, you stumble across Richard Lee, obviously. He was the guy in the beginning.
Nope.
No, he wasn't.
I mean, I did stumble across him, much to my chagrin, but that came a little later.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was actually my writing partner, my longtime collaborator, Ian, who was a musician. And he was on tour with his band, State of Emergency, in Seattle, maybe a year after Kurt died. So we're looking at, let's say he's touring Seattle in 1995.
I'm actually jealous.
Maybe even late 1994. It might just have been a few months later. And he has this musician community that's sort of like there's an overlap between musicians and the drug scene, the heroin scene.
Right.
And this is pretty important to how we get into this. I've never really talked about this before, actually, but it's how Ian ends up meeting Kurt Cobain. So he had actually stumbled upon Kurt Cobain while Kurt was still alive in Montreal. We're from Montreal. Kurt was touring, and these Bulgarian musicians that he hung around with that were also junkies. They had a connection, and when there's a touring musician from the States going into Canada, you're a junkie. You need your hit. You cannot bring your drugs on the plane or the tour bus, right?
Right.
And so you're told contact these people, they'll hook you up.
I,
Keith Richards famously got arrested for heroin in Toronto even
yeah.
before that, right? And it was all part of that same culture. And so Ian ends up through these Bulgarian musicians, ends up being asked for heroin by Kurt Cobain. It was really the Bulgarians, but those Bulgarians later connected us to Dylan Carlson, or let us know where Dylan Carlson was going to be jamming and shooting up in Seattle. So it was a pretty important connection. But really, it starts with Ian being on tour, just coincidentally on tour in Seattle. He's going all over the US with his band. And he through these Bulgarian junkie connections, he ends up being privy to the first sort of whispers that the recent alleged suicide of Kurt Cobain wasn't how it's being portrayed.
So this is something that's being talked about within the circle Kurt ran with.
Exactly.
And it makes total sense. Just to add something real quick, I had read that a part of the reason why Kurt loved Courtney so much was she was known to be able to score anywhere in the world. Like you said, he could not cross borders. He couldn't take that chance of taking his stuff with him. So if he took Courtney with him, well, she knew people all over the world.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about that. I think,
really?
Once you have those circles, you know where to go. I don't think somebody like Kurt is going to have a problem. And again, he knew,
well, you're talking about 94. I'm talking about 91, like 90, yeah. 91.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. After he would have made connections, he would not have needed to I get it. Okay.
So we start hearing these, he starts hearing these whispers that there's more to the story. He comes back. I'm station manager of one of North America's largest community alternative radio stations, CKCU. And so I have these, I guess I have some alternative music cred, our magazine.
Well, yeah, in the 90s, radio will make or break a band.
Oh, absolutely.
Radio and MTV.
Especially before sort of alternative music started making its way into the mainstream, right?
Right.
Which Nirvana really did, but before that, it was all campus community, underground radio, etc. And so our magazine, Trans FM, was the very first magazine ever, including in Seattle, to put Nirvana on the cover. Nice. We interviewed the band. One of our DJs was interviewing Chris Novoselic, and nobody had really ever heard of Nirvana. There was some buzz in alternative music circles at that time. And Chris, the DJ asks a question. Chris says, "Hey, Kurt, come over here. She's got a question for you." And so, we were interviewing Nirvana before anybody had ever heard of Nirvana outside Pacific Northwest. That later on ended up being advantageous, right? I was able to use those credentials and get into Sub Pop, for example, right? We had a relationship with Sub Pop. We were playing their artists. So I was able to knock on the door of Sub Pop and that sort of thing, right? Once we started investigating.
Interesting.
But he comes back with this crazy conspiracy theory. Oh, Kurt didn't self. There's whispers that he was murdered.
So really, it was Ian. Ian kind of comes to you and he's like, "Hey, this is what I'm hearing," and you're like, "Oh, okay, interesting."
I didn't think it was interesting at all.
Oh, you didn't.
Crackpot conspiracy theory, and that's pretty well what I said. That's
fair enough.
I'm old enough to remember. Actually, I'm not quite old enough to remember like people like Brian Jones in the 60s and Jimi Hendrix dying, but I did know that whenever a rock star dies of a heroin overdose or whatever, there's like whispers and there's various theories that he was actually murdered. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison is still alive. That's the type of conspiracy theories that existed then. But it's also important to remember that in those days there were conspiracy theories like that. and maybe, UFOs and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
people would dismiss a conspiracy theory with a smirk, or, roll their eyes. But it's very different. This is pre-Trump, right? Like, conspiracy theory has taken on a completely different meaning today than it had in the mid 90s, right, when this was going on, right? And yet I immediately dismissed it as a crackpot conspiracy theory. It wasn't quite as ludicrous. I mean, remember, the majority of Americans believe that JFK was there was a conspiracy to assassinate JFK, right? That was the first major, widely believed conspiracy theory in probably the world, right? So other than, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in Russia and the protocols of the Elders of Zion and that sort of thing, right? But that was a mainstream conspiracy theory that was embraced by Americans. And so there was this acknowledgement that, most conspiracy theories are preposterous, but it's possible. And that's the way I think people looked upon the first rumblings of Kurt was murdered. It was dismissed by a lot of people, certainly, including members of Nirvana, but it wasn't completely, somebody who repeated it was a total crackpot. It's hard to, unless you live through that era, it's hard to sort of make the distinction between how people perceived a conspiracy theory in those days. But it was very, but nevertheless, I dismissed it immediately.
But obviously there was something that made you want to investigate this.
What made me open to investigating was that he said, here, I don't even think he knew the name, but he said, her Courtney Love's private investigator thinks that Kurt was murdered. And that made me sit up and take notice, at least enough to, I don't even think Google existed then, right? But the internet did. So I looked it up, and sure enough, there was this Tom Grant. And at that
time, he was sort of touring radio stations, wasn't he? Around 95 or so. He had appeared on a few radio talk shows.
I think so, but we might have given him his first, we might have actually contacted him before any of that stuff. So this guy, Richard Lee, it turned out, was doing his public service TV show in Seattle. Called Kurt Cobain Was Murdered, or whatever it was called, right? And I thought, that's interesting. And to give that guy credit, and I don't give him a lot of credit, Richard Lee, but he actually, posed the theory long before Tom Grant did. He was the very first, right? This is in the days after Kurt's death that he starts this TV show. And
that's weird to me that he would pose such a theory without having any, like, he didn't have the autopsy. He didn't know what Tom Grant knew.
Exactly.
And he was still okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And I think we dismissed him in our book, as a bit of a kook, but we also gave him some credibility, right? We gave him credit for
maybe a lucky kook.
No, I don't know. He had his own connections, and he was probably hearing these same whispers before Ian was, right? So you have to give him some credit. He's not a crackpot. He just comes off as one. He's, if we met him, he gave us a tour. He brought us to Kurt's house. He brought us to the greenhouse, right? So he sort of introduced us to once we got to Seattle. And then he very quickly became suspicious of us, or started bad-mouthing us, right? Maybe a little jealous that we were getting a lot of attention at some point. So
I see.
And we weren't very nice to him in our first book either. So I don't blame him for being wary of us. But really, I feel a little bad about that, because
he wasn't very nice to the members of Nirvana. I know that. So it's not like he's never.
That's years later. Now he's been dismissed as a total crackpot, and I haven't really followed his career. But again, this is like, mid 90s, right? Where he's already talking about this stuff on TV, and some of his facts were pretty good.
Okay.
He had, I don't know, you can't really call them inside sources, right? But he's the one that supposedly broke I think his first big scoop, if you call it that, was about the funeral home, right? I I
That's
don't think he made that up, right? That's certainly possible. I forget what his claim was, that people came in and photographed Kurt's body, or I don't know.
they danced with his corpse listening to Pearl Jam. They cut his hair and his
Right.
fingernails. There's rumor that the funeral home paid out a certain sum to Wendy O'Connor.
Yeah. That
There
all
is.
started with Richard Lee, right? So he certainly, and I don't think he made that up. That's quite common with celebrities. People had sex with Marilyn Monroe's corpse when she was in the funeral home, right? So this is a
Right.
common thing. You slip somebody $100, and the badly paid mortuary workers. So
It's sick, but that's a lot of the reason why famous people often put like concrete over their burial or whatever.
right,
There are people out there who I've read about cases where people have dug people up. It's sick, but it happens.
yeah. But so we, at least all that stuff was enough to make me want to pursue it. I was a music journalist of sorts, and we wrote a magazine article about the case. Still
Mm-hmm.
skeptical, but we talked about Tom Grant, and we talked about some of the facts that had come out, some of the inconsistencies, and that's it. It was just this magazine article, and then I never thought it would go anywhere after that. And then we had an offer to write a book, and we got a publishing deal, and the rest is
Nice.
history, right? 2 books later, here I am talking to you. What is it? It's been
28
25
years.
years.
Yeah, 25 years later.
In April, it'll be 25 years since my first book,
And
since our first book came out.
are you aware that your the second book, and I apologize, like I told you, I didn't even know there was a first book. I want to read the first book, but people were telling me that your second book is going for over $100 on Amazon.
Wow.
Did you know that?
I wish I were getting a cut of that, but
Yeah, so somebody was complaining to me like, I tried to get Wallace's book and people want like $100 for it. So it's
I think
it's still being read. Like,
I think it's for sale. It hasn't gone out of print as far as
oh,
I
it
know.
hasn't
You can
gone
get
out
it
of
in the
print.
library, so I don't know why anybody would, unless it's a signed copy or something like that. Um,
Maybe they were unaware that it's still
yeah,
being printed. I don't
maybe.
know.
Well, maybe
Well,
that first book. The first book is harder to get because it's interesting. The first book comes out in 1998,
maybe it was
and
the first book they were talking about. Then
maybe,
I'll talk to them and let them know it's
maybe.
still in print.
But that book, the publisher didn't think it was going to go that far. It had a fairly limited press run, and then Howard Stern gets a hold of the story, and
Yeah,
Howard Stern requests an interview. So I go on Howard Stern, and at that time, Howard Stern was still on terrestrial free radio. Hundreds of radio stations. He had 20 million listeners,
yeah.
and I go on the show. He gives me a half hour. He has people call in. I remember somebody called in and said, "Oh, this guy is some faggot that's sitting in his mother's basement spinning conspiracy theories." But Howard Stern took it seriously and let us get
I'm
the facts.
laughing because someone's actually said that to me.
Yeah, I'm sure. But 24 hours later, the book was sold out in every bookstore, right? There was a huge run on it. The publisher wanted to be able to, they could have sold another 50,000 copies, but they just couldn't get it out fast enough. And then they waited for paperback. But that's where we got a lot of momentum. And that certainly
Right.
helped for the 10th anniversary. Then we had a major publishing deal to publish Love and Death, right? And that took on a life of its own. But it was that
Yeah.
first book that really spread the theory. Although that book only came out after Kurt and Courtney, the documentary by Nick Broomfield, which we worked on as well.
Right.
A
And that
lot happened in between.